think it's managing to the most probable business risk. People may not believe in the hacker, but they absolutely believe in the auditor. They've seen the auditor. They've been in the conference room with the auditor. So that's the most probable business risk, and that's why compliance is, in some cases, so overweighted when you're doing risk analysis, because that's seen as the most probable risk.
Hello, and welcome to Trust Versus, a podcast powered by HITRUST, the global leader of cybersecurity assurance. My name is Ryan Patrick, Vice President of Adoption at HITRUST, joined today by Robert Booker, a board member of HITRUST, but also the former Chief Strategy Officer.
Today, we're talking about a subject that it's near and dear to many of our hearts, especially in the recent days, this concept of resilience and resiliency and what that means for the culture of an organization, and specifically how the people interact with technology, leadership, governance, all these things. But ultimately, we're talking about those human beings, the people that are at the sharp end on these things, the ones that put their personal passions into the challenges we face. And oftentimes, as we've seen in past months, the ones that are unfortunately hit the hardest when the things just fall apart.
Yeah, I'm actually really passionate about this topic, and we brought in a wonderful guest today. Her name is Wendy Nather, a respected cybersecurity strategist who's helped organizations recover in lots of different ways, everything from ransomware to real-world disasters. And the real-world disasters part is something that I'm keenly interested in, having a military background and been kind of a first responder of sorts in helping folks recover from real-world disasters. So she's here to talk to us today about true resiliency planning, and it starts with understanding what people actually need in a crisis, not just what the policy says they should do.
Such a good topic, Wendy, and so grateful for you taking the time and your energy to help educate our audience and us about the things you've experienced and the practices you've found to be successful in this area. So maybe I could just start by, for those that may not know you from your body of work, have you introduce yourself, kind of how did you get to the place you are today in your career, and what really got you interested in this topic?
Well, thanks. It's great to be here. I'll have to tell you that how the process by which I got here was completely accidental. I just kind of drifted from one thing to another. I started as a system administrator and then was sent into security when I was working for a Swiss bank. So I've been in the private sector as well as the public sector in security. Then I became an industry analyst for 5 years. I was a research director at the Retail and Hospitality ISAC. So I am currently at 1Password. I am Senior Research Initiatives Director.
That's excellent. And I find that many of the people that have done this with the most experience are often like you. They're very wide ranging and probably less planful than many people would think they are in their career trajectory. So welcome to the club. I think you'll find a few kindred spirits at HITRUST that come from similar backgrounds. And actually that brings me to the topic of the day, which is really the intersection of something really important like resilience, but also culture. And as we're thinking about the people that do this work, oftentimes they're really mission-oriented individuals. They saw a challenge, they saw a problem, or something appeared and there was white space to be filled, and those people said, hey, that needs to be taken care of and it's an important job, so I'll step into that space. And suddenly people find that they're the experts in that space. From your professional experience, what does resilience look like in practice? And especially when you think about the fact that it's ultimately the people that hold things together when a crisis happens.
Yeah, I have polled people about what they think the word resilience means, and a surprising number of them believe that activities that I would call prevention also come under the practice of resilience. In other words, trying to keep the bad things from happening to begin with. And I don't really buy that. I personally feel that resilience is what happens after the bad thing happens, recovering from it. But a large number of people don't agree with me. I think we can all unite in talking about, well, whether you start you consider the planning for resilience to be part of resilience or not. At the end of the day, we all end up together after the bad thing happens.
Yeah, that's interesting, Wendy, because to me, resilience happens after the bang, right? When the big bang happens, the actions you take after that is really what's defined as resilience in my mind. And that can come in lots of different ways, shapes, and forms. But I think there is an aspect of planning that happens before the bang in order to make you successful after the bang.
The problem with planning is that you can't plan for most of the things that you're thinking about. And one common myth that I've seen in resilience is that it's all about recovering back to 100% of your baseline. Sometimes you have to be able to operate in a degraded capacity for some amount of time, and you may not ever make it back to the baseline that you were at before the event. So I think some people have a view of resilience that is kind of limited, and you find that when you're in the middle of a crisis, you're just saying, okay, what's the minimum viable functionality that we need to keep things running? And I imagine, Ryan, in your experience, especially in the military, that's kind of, well, let's just make this work somehow.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things, and I think we'll get into this throughout the conversation, is no plan survives first contact. When the bullets start flying, the plan normally flies out the window. And in the military, the way it works is as long as you understand the mission and your commander's intent, you have the freedom, you're empowered to make decisions to deal with the situation that's in front of you. And I think that resonates from a resiliency perspective, right? You have to understand what are the business objectives in order to be resilient. And once you get into that incident, whatever it may be, you may not have anticipated everything, to your point, Wendy, and you have to make decisions and make changes kind of on the fly. But as long as you're making those decisions through the lens of the business objectives or the targets or whatever the circumstances may be, you're probably in a safe place.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a friend who served in the Marines, and when I've had to go through a lot of difficult times personally in my life. And when I've consulted with friends, a lot of them have been, oh my gosh, this is terrible. You need support. How are you taking care of yourself? That sort of thing. But then I go to my Marine friend who's also named Ryan, and he gives me a completely different perspective on it. Some of it is just put on your big girl panties and just do it, take care of it. But the other philosophy that I hear from him that I really like is the reassurance. He will say, you are in the right place at the right time to be dealing with this. You are the right person. You have what you need. And that sense of confidence to be saying, however you feel about the incident that's going on right now, you can have the confidence to know that you can take care of the mission, even if nothing is going according to plan.
Yeah, I think that's where the people aspect that you're so passionate about comes into this, is understanding the psychology of what's happening during a crisis, because normal people probably going to freak out when a crisis happens, especially some kind of real world disaster. And there is a level of comfort and a mindset that needs to be instilled in order to operate in an environment of chaos. And that takes time, that takes training, that takes effort. And one thing that I'm passionate about is you actually have to care, right? If you don't have people that care, you can't be successful. So recognizing the people that care and putting them into positions of decision-making or responsibility in case there's some kind of incident, I think is a commonly missed aspect of resiliency and crisis management.
I remember I had business continuity as a significant part of my responsibility for a health system for a number of years. And we spent much time and energy on doing business continuity planning, disaster recovery planning, enterprise resiliency planning with the business leaders of the enterprise. And we always had this thing called business impact analysis. You know, what systems are going to come back in 4 hours, 8 hours, 24 hours, 36 hours. I mean, those were literally the thresholds we planned against. And that company actually experienced a situation a year ago, very public, I won't name them, but they were down for literally well over 4 weeks, and if even longer, depending on parts of the system. And the people I know and trust there, I had the impression in conversations with them that it was the ultimate example of what, Ryan, you just described, is that a plan does not survive contact with the enemy. Everything they planned for had to go out the window, but somehow they got back on their feet. It was very painful, I understand. But with all that said, Wendy, we start to say, okay, maybe I'm just starting my journey, or maybe I'm a small startup that actually is building a plan for the first time. How do we think about these concepts of business impact analysis and actually making good, sound decisions that have some flexibility and agility in them? What would we tell people that are starting this journey?
Well, I like the decision frameworks that Melanie Ensign's company, Discernible, puts forward. And she argues that it's actually best to have a decision framework in place rather than creating templates or things like that. I think there's room for both of those in planning. But yeah, ultimately, when everything goes out the window, who's the decider? You have to know who the decider is. And if that person isn't there in a planning exercise, I like to say, okay, you go sit outside. You're not part of this anymore. Now let's see who steps up to be the decider. And if you can figure out that, then you can figure out everything else. That's my theory.
So it's really clarity over who is at the table, who is responding, maybe who's supporting that's not at the table but helping. I recall when we were building, or the administration was building healthcare.gov, the fact that every voice for a number of months around that administration had the authority and the position to say this is what it will be, but clearly you found that everybody's definition of what it will be was different. So it ultimately, when it came to recovering that system, eventually it came down to these are the only people that represent the administration. These are the only people that represent the system owners. And they're the ones that have the authority to make the call because they're empowered, to your point, to make that call. So I like that decision support model a lot. I think that makes a lot of sense, especially in dealing with an uncertain circumstance.
I did some research when I was at Cisco together with the Scientia Institute on security outcomes. What sort of practices tend to lead to the kind of security outcomes that we want as professionals? And one thing that we did find is that those who did role-specific security awareness training were more likely to report that they had a stronger detection and response capability. In other words, not just everybody sitting in front of a 15-minute video once a year, but getting role-specific training saying, this is what you're likely to see in your role. This is what it will look like. These are the things we're going to ask you to report, and these are the things we're going to ask you to decide on, is what really makes for a resilient organization. Everybody knows what it's going to look like from their side and what part they have to play.
I'd like to ask both of you this question, because I know based on both your backgrounds, you've had some experience with the concept of either red teaming or tabletop exercises. If you think about working through exercises and actually building maybe that muscle memory to know what to do, how do you approach those things? And what are the kind of things organizations should be doing when they do planning and exercises to work through the experience necessary so when it happens for real, they've got the best chance at success?
Well, again, with the research I was doing with Scientia, we found that the larger number of different scenarios that they worked through in these sorts of exercises, the better they got. And especially if they incorporated any chaos engineering, thinking of things or having things happen that they did not think of and did not plan. But practicing, as you said, that muscle memory of responding to something completely unanticipated was really important in them being able to do this. For this reason, a lot of people like tabletop exercises, but by definition, you are able to plan those out. And that's not a replacement for actually doing a simulation. For example, do you have any idea whether your infrastructure is going to hold up to 120,000 people all changing their password at the same time, multiple times? You won't know until you try it, or just about anything else. That if you do a simulation, that's when you discover that somebody's laptop on their desk is actually running a server in production that nobody knew about. So finding the unknowns has to be a part of practicing resilience, but it's hard to do that when you plan it. So everybody has to take turns inflicting these sort of scenarios on each other so that everybody gets a chance to practice for the unexpected.
Something we think a lot about here is the assurance. So organizations having the ability to demonstrate that they've met the expectations, they're mature, and usually for the purpose of compliance. And actually, to the point you just made of perhaps knowing the test is coming and what's on the test, I really like that concept of chaos engineering, because I find that human beings become very accustomed to saying, well, I know I'm going to be asked 5 questions the next time somebody comes in and does a test. So I've gotten very practiced at answering those 5 questions and sounding incredibly competent. But if question 3 is not on the test and question number 99 that nobody ever thought of becomes the thing that matters the most, is that kind of how you think about it?
No, I think that's a great way of putting it. That's a great way of putting it. Situations like when I was working for the bank and the Chicago River broke into the tunnels underneath the loop in Chicago and flooded all the basements there. Our data center was on the 11th floor, but it didn't matter because when your basement's flooded, you're not going to have power. And I remember some of my colleagues carrying a Sun 4 server down 11 flights of stairs in the dark, because that was the easiest way to go reproduce our production backbone outside of the city. And so that's the sort of thing that you don't think about. Like, are we physically going to have to carry some things? And who thought that the river would flood the downtown area?
I have a similar story. We had one of the weather events that struck the Houston area some years back. The company was very, very practiced at confidentiality protections with regard to data. So you couldn't take certain data assets out of certain places. And our staff were so well trained that you just simply cannot do that. No exceptions. That when it came time to literally move some of these processes to machines that were far beyond what we would have desired from a security perspective, nobody knew who had the authority to say yes to that. And it really took going all the way up to the top of the company saying, well, we need permission to do this. And I still remember the executive that gave the permission saying, you're asking me this now? Please just go do the right thing. You know what to do. And so we can become so good at our process, we forget to ask what happens if that process doesn't meet the needs.
I think that's why these types of exercises or in simulations are so important, right? There was a saying in my previous life around homeland response that you shouldn't be trading business cards at the incident site. You should already know who you're going to be working with if there's an incident, and understanding each other's role and how they're going to make decisions is really important, because you may have one element of a business that plans to execute in a certain way, and it doesn't support what the IT team either can do or should do. So you're able to iron those things out up front, and it just strengthens your ability to be resilient when and if something happens. So it's really, really important to bring all the relevant stakeholders, even the folks that you may not even think about, to the table, and either have them listen or participate, because that's really where the magic happens. One of my favorite exercises that I ever developed, went to a hospital for a TTX. There was an airport right next to the hospital. The original scenario was that their main EHR went down. So everybody was scrambling to move to paper records and paper charts and all of those things. Well, then I had a plane run short of the runway and hit a bus. So now their EHR is down. They're going to manual processes, but now there's a mass casualty event, right? So it completely came out of left field for everybody that was in the room, and they had to work through what that would look like. So it's really, really important. I'm repeating myself to a certain degree here. Have the right people in the room. Invite people that you may not think are relevant, but may be. Like, think about your public relations folks, your legal counsel, things of that nature. They should be in the room. But think about crazy ideas. Try to anticipate as much as you can.
I love the idea of throwing something else into the mix. When I've worked on scenarios for the Atlantic Council for their Cyber 912 challenge, where they take college students, graduate and undergraduate, who have majored in international relations, policy, cybersecurity, law, all sorts of things, and giving them a very large scenario, a cyber incident with global implications. And the motto is always, how can we make a bad day in cybersecurity even worse? So I have so much fun going through that. For the competition in Geneva, our partners, they wanted a space scenario. So I got to write a scenario about cyber attacks on satellites. And that's a sort of thing where, as a student, you can argue laws, but you cannot argue with the laws of physics. And physics come into play very much when you're talking about satellites in low Earth orbit. So that's tremendous fun. And I'm always impressed by how adaptable and quick thinking these students are for coming up with briefing the equivalent of the National Security Council on how they should be responding to this incident.
We're talking about chaos engineering and kind of the concept of being agile and thoughtful about that. I'm curious about that as it relates to the people. And in the same way we think about business recovery strategies, like we expect things to work the way we plan, perhaps we also think about we expect people to be at their full abilities and their full capacity and thinking the most clearly when they're under tremendous pressure. How do we introduce chaos into the people, which is, again, one of the most important dimensions of this?
Yeah, I mean, Robert, you just teed that up so well, because I do talk about how security needs to be usable on your worst day. And they understand this very well in the military. They have operational instructions and practice and things that look to lay people to look really incredibly simple and kind of stupid sounding, like front toward enemy. But it's not that. It's that you need it to be as easy to use as possible when you're not at your best. And I've told the story about how when my husband died of brain cancer, it was 2 weeks from the time he was diagnosed until he passed away. He had not left me anything except a master password for his password database that was written on a piece of paper in a secured location, but he didn't tell me where it was. And I had no logins into the infrastructure that he ran for us. He had run it in our house for 30 years, and I never touched it. And I was just emotionally and mentally incapable of laying my hands on the keyboards. And I should have been able to find things, break into things as a security person, and yet I could not bring myself to do it. Just emotionally, I couldn't do it. And so a friend of mine offered to come in and break into everything for me. And that was H.D. Moore. He came in and broke into all the laptops, reset all the passwords and everything. And even after he gave me access, I still could not sit in front of the keyboard and actually touch anything or make any changes. So you're absolutely right. This is the sort of support that we need to be able to give people, and people get stressed and fall apart in different ways. And so when you're dealing with business people who are not technical and are dealing with chaos and they're distressed depending on what kind of incident this is, it's really important for everybody to be trained on how to give each other that psychological safety, as you described it.
Yeah, I would add to that, because I completely agree with you that it may not even be that they're exhausted, right? As Robert mentioned, they could be working 24, 36, 48 hours straight. That's a real concern. But another concern is they're just not available, especially in the business context, right? Someone could be on vacation. Someone could be in some remote location that they don't have access to do the things that they need to do because nobody plans for an incident. Incidents just happen. So it's really important, I think, and I'm curious what your thoughts are, Wendy, to train the people to your left and to your right on what your actions are. So in case that you're not available, they can pick up the mantle, so to speak, and do the things that you need to do, whether it's left or right or up and down.
Oh, absolutely. And yes, succession planning is very important. First of all, if you don't have anybody else who can do your job, you can't take time off. So that's a very important aspect to keep in mind. And also when I plan some exercises, and there are a number of people in the room and we've talked through a decision framework, I love to point at somebody and say, okay, you go sit outside. We're going to pretend that you're not here. You're in the Bahamas and you don't have cell signal. Now let's rerun this again and find out who is going to step up. And so, yes, practicing to your left and to your right and briefing up and down and coming up with rerouting things on the fly, rerouting business processes and technical processes as you need them is really, really important. My former deputy, who is now at the Texas Department of Transportation, gave a great talk about how he started there on the day that they had a ransomware attack, and at the same time, they were going into lockdown for the pandemic. So they had disabled all the badge readers. Nobody could come in. There was only one person left in their data center, and he was setting up VPN access for everybody. And he couldn't leave because he had to prop the door open. He couldn't physically leave the data center without making sure he could get back in. So those sorts of combinations of things, who's going to be left holding the bag? If it's just one person, are they going to be ready for it? And how can you support them? That's another really important aspect to this planning.
One of the things that happens in many organizations is, and I think we can all think of people that have worked for us, or perhaps we've been the person, and that person that always steps in. Like I had a deputy in a position once that she would be the person that would literally always do everything. Like in any kind of an exercise, any kind of a response, any kind of a planning session, this individual was the person that, even if it was outside her role, she was going to be the one that stepped in because that was her nature. Hyper confident and hyper capable. I mean, like the organization was so blessed to have this lady on our team, but we had to thoughtfully at the executive level think about exercise planning in a way that we asked her to not be present, which was very hard because it's always for those people, I find that they're so motivated. It's like, well, you're excluding me. It must be because I've done something wrong. Like, no, we need the organization to be able to survive. If you happen to be the person that's gone to the Bahamas or taking the long earned vacation to do something that you really want to do with your family. So it's so important for us to imagine our dynamics of not even just the organizational hierarchy, but the unspoken hierarchies of who are the people that are always the ones that do everything. And if those people become unavailable for any number of reasons, how are you going to survive?
That's one of the scenarios that I think is important to talk through when you're doing tabletop exercises. Another great use of tabletop exercises is to bring forward the risks that maybe your management is not considering as probable. For example, I have a friend who was a CISO at a large hospital system, and he used a tabletop exercise to talk about ransomware. And he said to the executives, okay, we're talking through this and this and this. At which point do we pay the ransom? And should I set up a Bitcoin wallet right now to do that? And their eyes got real big, and it became more real to them when he actually talked through, okay, is this the point where I do this now? Do I have your permission to do this? Then they finally were willing to talk about it. Another thing he asked is, at which point do I have permission to take down the network to prevent the spread of the ransomware? And he actually got permission, which is amazing to me in a healthcare situation, that they could actually agree to say, yes, in this situation, you can take down the network and make things unavailable. But talking through those things really helped a lot to get management on his side when just doing a regular briefing didn't do the trick for him.
I'm curious about the dynamic that exists in any highly regulated industry or company where you have regulatory considerations, you have post-incident enforcement considerations. Many of us live in America where class action litigation is a thing, whether we hate it or love it. And I think actually the conversation around the balance between do the right thing versus be transparent and open to the market versus the potential of long-term legal risk and liability or compliance risk long-term. To me, this is a really, I'll use the term toxic because I can't think of another way to describe it, a toxic conflict that happens where is it the general counsel that is going to say, well, we're not going to do that because it puts us at risk, which means we're not going to recover because we can't. And we're not going to tell our customers what happened because we don't want to create an appearance of the worst case liability. Wendy, I'm actually, having lived in those scenarios on a couple of occasions, it's such an important thing. I'm curious how you would advise me and others to really think about that, because to me, it could be the most paralyzing thing of all.
Oh, you're so right. And I don't know if I would call it a toxic situation. I think it's managing to the most probable business risk. Sure. People may not believe in the hacker, but they absolutely believe in the auditor. So if they've seen the auditor, they've been in the conference room with the auditor. So that's the most probable business risk. And that's why compliance is in some cases so overweighted when you're doing risk analysis, because that's seen as the most probable risk. So I absolutely understand that everyone is going to be looking at risk through a different lens, and they're going to focus on the biggest business risks first, even if that gets in the way of solving for the technical risk.
We mentioned the kind of the people factor earlier on in the conversation, and we touched on whether they're just absent because of vacation or whatever reason, people are unavailable, or they're overworked as possible scenarios. There's another scenario where they're present, they're just incapable because the scenario is just completely overwhelming to them.
Yeah.
Is there any advice that you would have to, whether it be security leaders or business leaders, in thinking about resiliency, on how to coach them or deal with that type of scenario where they're incapable of doing their job?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And as I touched on with my story, you never know when someone's going to be incapable of doing what they should be able to do theoretically. And again, that's why I think making psychological safety part of the culture and part of the planning for resilience is so important, to be able to talk about incidents where you may find yourself incapable of doing what you know you need to do, or somebody next to you. People tend to fall apart in different ways, or they're affected in different ways by incidents. They're stressed in different ways. They cope with them in different ways. And so that's part of assessing what's going on in an incident around you and seeing who's having trouble, who needs to take over in order to get something done, and making it safe to do that. To say, look, you're one of the people having a hard time right now, and we understand. This is normal. This happens. We will get back to this when we get things restored, and we will give you the support that you need. And I imagine, Ryan, in the military, you had to deal with that sort of thing too.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's actually less about a combat scenario and more of incident response. When I was in New York in the National Guard, we had 2 hurricanes come through New York, which is highly uncommon. And it happened 2 years in a row. And there was a real issue with the service members who were being activated to respond, who had their minds on their own homes and their own families.
Yeah.
So they were completely distracted from the mission, which is completely understandable, right? So it is a really difficult thing to overcome. And I think it's probably case by case how you approach that. I love your idea of psychological safety, right? And a culture of being open, candid, and transparent about the issues that you're having. But I think there's a team dynamic here as well, right? I touched on people caring. The team can help pick people up, whether doing their role or helping them in support to get their role to operate. So yeah, it's a really interesting thing to dissect after the fact. In the moment, it's a lot more difficult, but it is probably far more common than people would think about.
So Wendy, I maybe give you the last words here. And is there anything that, in your experience, I know you speak a lot in the space, you talk to a lot of people, you do a lot of research. Is there something we haven't thought about around this topic, or just some words you'd like to leave that you think are really important for people to take away from our time together?
I think the most important thing to bear in mind in security is that we are all just making this up as we go along. There are a lot of verticals where things have been running for hundreds of years, or we understand engineering principles. We know exactly what works and what doesn't. That's not the case in security. So I think we need to give ourselves and each other a certain amount of grace in dealing with these things, because not only do you have unexpected incidents that you have to deal with, but even regular things where the technology changes, circumstances change, business changes, geopolitical incidents happen, whatever. And so improvisation is part of our job, no matter what happens. And so I think a lot of people are naturally very meticulous and they want to plan everything out. And I just want to say you just can't. But part of our superpower is being able to take the experience and the skills that we have and improvise on them really fast. And so that's what I would leave people with.
Wendy, I want to thank you very much for taking your time, and also congratulate you on facilitating the great sessions that you've done at Black Hat and other places. And I think we're happy to have leaders like you that we can all learn from.
Thanks so much, Wendy. I really enjoyed this conversation, especially your last comments around improvisation and kind of making things up as you go, because it's nearly impossible, as you shared with us, to plan for every circumstance or every incident's makeup. And there has to be some agility and flexibility to make sure that organizations can respond. One of the things that really resonated with me was our talk about the people factor when it comes to culture, not just trying to establish the culture, but working with the people factor culturally generally, but also before, during, or after an incident, because people may not be able to function depending on the way the incident occurs and what is going on in their personal lives. So thanks so much. If you like the show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Thanks for listening.